Once you've got a reasonable sized army, you're going to need somebody to lead it. And who's going to lead our slaves to darkness? It's going to be some Chaos Lords. Let's have a look at what we're going to do with those after this. Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Wayne. Thanks for joining me again. Slaves to Darkness Chaos Lords. We're going to need some leaders for our army, and they come in a couple of varieties. The standard Chaos Lord model is a little bit long in the tooth, to say the least. It's still fairly cool though, the dude with the spear. However, it's not really to my taste, and I don't think it's going to fit in with the army. I want something a little bit bulkier, a little bit spikier, a little bit more vicious looking. So I'm going to proxy it out for one of the Chaos Lords, and the other one is going to be the Chaos Lord on Karkadrak. This model is really, really cool. Of course, we're going to follow a similar formula to what we've already followed with our Chosen and our Chaos Knights. Obviously, these guys have a little bit more oomph about them, a little bit more clout. They are a little bit higher up the food chain in the army, and so we want to pay a little bit more attention to them. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to build on what we've already established in the previous videos, and we're just going to start to add a few additional details. And the other element that we're going to look at is the Karkadrak. Now, that's something that we've not tackled before. We had the chariot with the Gore Beast proxy and the horse proxy. But what we want to do here is look at how we can bring in that Karkadrak so that it fits in with the tone of the army. It doesn't have its own unique color palette, but it stands out enough to make it look more like a centerpiece, more like a leader's mount should do. Let's crack on, get straight into it, and let's see what we end up with. But before we do, if you're enjoying the series, do give me a like and subscribe. I do appreciate it. I won't go on too much about it. Let's jump straight in and figure this one out. We're going to start off from a familiar base now. So if you've not checked out the earlier videos in this series, specifically the Chaos Warriors, please go back and do that now. Okay, what have I done so far then? Well, I've dry brushed the model, working up from that warm grey, giving more attention to details that I want to pick out, making those a little bit brighter. So we're looking at the face here. I've also done the standard armor recipe that we've already established on the Chaos Warriors and the Knights. So we've worked up from that deep gunmetal up to a silver, and then we've started to pick out the brass. On the base, I've picked out a couple of details using the same warm grey, and then just using skeleton horde contrast paint over the top to pick out the skulls. This is in a couple of sub-assemblies as well to make painting a little bit easier. And that's going to be the base that we're going to work from this model. This chap you might not recognize. It's a proxy and it's fantastic. I love this sculpt. Now, I've started off in exactly the same way as we have previously as well. So referencing that Chaos Warriors video, we've started off using that warm grey, stippled up the leather. We've got the metals done in exactly the same way, starting with that deep gunmetal, working up to a brass. And I've picked out a couple of the details such as the furs. And you'll notice that I've not painted the cape or the loincloth. We're going to do that a little bit different. And obviously we will have that underlighting coming up from the base later on. Okay, that's the base for both of the models. Let's crack on with where the differences lie then. That's where we're going to start. First thing we're going to do is grab our blue color, and we're going to start by applying this to the cape. Yes, indeed, the cape. Now, I know we've been previously doing these brown, but these being the Lords, I want something to make them stand out on the battlefield, as well as just their imposing presence. Having a little bit of color differentiation is going to make, at a glance, them much easier to recognize. So we're going to get this applied to the cape and also to the loincloth. Now, this is going to be specifically for the Chaos Lords. I've got something else planned for the named characters. And this is, well, we've done this before, haven't we? We've done it on the weapon wraps. Just make sure you're going on with thin coats. If you're going to use normal acrylic paint, do thin it down into a glaze-like consistency. Or if you're using inks, absolutely thin that down a little bit, because inks are very highly saturated and you don't want it to be too shiny and bold on the battlefield. After all, we are going for that grim, dark, more muted tone, aren't we? Next, we're going to want to pick out some more details, and I'm going to use Contrast Wildwood here, the Games Workshop paint, to pick out the straps and any other bits and pieces like that around the model that I want to read as very dark leather. I'm not going to worry about being overly neat at this point, because I can always come back in and just pick out those buckles later on. I'm going for speed with this one. Just get it done, be as neat as possible, and don't worry too much about it. In a pretty good position now to start working on the rest of the model. The first thing we're going to do then is the armor. Now we're going to take some inspiration from what we did with the Chaos Chosen. We're going to have the armor more predominantly black. Yes, it's traditional, but it's still going to look fairly grungy, grimdark with the rest of our theme. We're not going to do what we did with the Varangard and introduce any of the color. That was specifically for those guys. For this, we just want to start working our way around the model, slowly but surely laying down that color into each of the armor panels, really helping to pick out that Baroque trim that Chaos Warriors, Chaos Lords do so love. Take your time here, make sure you've thinned your paints enough that a couple of layers is going to give you nice solid coverage, but it's still going to give you that metallic sheen underneath. I really like using contrast paints for this, but speed paint should work equally as well, or indeed thinned down ink. Now, if you make a mess, don't worry about it. As you saw there, I made a little bit of a faux pas on the helmet and I just wiped it off with my finger. It's as good as a sponge. Don't stress too much about it. The main thing here is using a reasonable brush and just taking your time. You'll speed up the more of them you do, so don't worry about it. You've already got some practice in from those Chaos Chosen if you're following the same scheme, and we're going to get some more with some of the later characters. So getting a good grounding in how to work nice and neat, basically painting inside the lines, is going to help you regardless of what you're painting, especially if you're going on to Space Marines as well. I mean, this is exactly the same technique as I use for those, so stick around for videos about Space Marines further down the line. Spoiler alert, we might have some kill team stuff coming up, especially Deathwatch. Onto the Karkadrak's armor then. With this, all I'm going to do is glaze on one single layer over the top of the armor. The reason being, I don't want it to read as the same black as the Chaos Lord's armor. The reason being, having a difference on the model gives it a little bit more visual interest and it differentiates the two. What can happen sometimes if you've gone too dark with the overall color scheme, and our scheme is quite dark, is that the models will start to bleed together. Now we do want to have some differentiation between the mount and the rider. You'll notice I am really using a very thin consistency of the paint here, and this is exactly the same black. I have just thinned it down a little bit further, and it is almost as a glaze this time round. Now I am working fairly fast as well. What I don't want to do is have any pooling or coffee staining. Both of those things can happen if you overly dilute the paint. The best thing to do is if you're getting to the point where the paint is actually starting to break up, then use some medium to thin it rather than just water. That will help. Now you can use Games Workshop contrast medium or speed paint medium. Either of those will thin the paint down enough that it keeps its properties, but it is much thinner to work with, less saturated, and is going to give you the glaze-like finish we want. Once you finish working your way around the model, getting all of the armor panels, we're in a pretty good position to start actually getting on with the rest of this Karkadrak then. Now that we've got black armor panels on both as Chaos Lords and that Karkadrak, we can start to think about what we want to tackle next. They're already starting to look like they're in a pretty good position, to be honest, so we can start to think about picking out those details, and of course, the main bulk of what we're going to do is going to be figuring out how we can paint that Karkadrak. Before we do though, let's just pick out another couple of details around the model, and we're going to use aluminium or any bright silver. It doesn't really matter to do that. Now, you could do this with a dry brushing step, or I'm just going to go straight in and start painting it directly onto the model as if I would normally. Now, I'm going to do this, just pick out the very tops of any element that I want to really stand out and pop. So the very tips of any spikes on there, perhaps. Any elements on any of the other metallics that you really want to read as prominent. So perhaps the corners of the stars, or in my case, I'm going to pick out the blades of the weapons. Now, I want to do this because I want to draw particular emphasis to the weapons, and, well, they're very similar to the armor. They're reading almost the same at the moment, so just by putting that extra little pop of detail on the blades, it's going to help just pick them out and move the viewer's eye from the weapons up to the face, and that's what we're going to see once we start to bring that pop of colour in the OSL that we've already used throughout the rest of his army. Stop teasing it out and we'll give some thought to the actual Karkadrak. Okay then, so how are we going to paint it? And that's a good question. I want to go for something more natural, so I'm going to take inspiration from the natural world. The scales I want to be much darker, but not out of sync with the rest of the color palette. We can break it down into 3 separate areas: the armor plating, the basic scales, and then the softer, fleshy underbelly. When we look at nature, we can see that there's this seam of where they grew together, I assume, and that's always a little bit lighter, a little bit redder. So with that in mind, let's start with that softer, fleshy underbelly, and I'm going to use a contrast paint Fire Slayer Flesh here. Again, I'm going to thin it down as I always do, and I'm going to use a fairly large brush. Now, I'm going to make sure my brush is wet. This is something that I pretty much always do when I'm using contrast paints, and I'm going to put it on very thinly as a glaze. Now, you can always add more to darken it, and that's exactly what we're going to do. Applying it quite liberally with that damp brush all over the underbelly of this Karkadrak. I'm not being overly careful at the moment. I can always come back in and re-establish those leather belts later on. That's not too much of a problem. What I'm doing is just sketching in the color values. I'm trying to decide if this is the direction that I want to take, and I think it's fairly evident early on that it is. I'm pretty certain this is going to work. Now, why am I so certain now? Well, thinking about the basing scheme, we've got our OSL, the light is going to be cast up underneath it. So having a lighter color under here is going to give us a nice variation in tone. We're going to get that fleshy tone, and then we're going to get that warmer, lavary, chaotic glow that's coming up from the base. Again, looking back at my reference material here, I want to make sure that we apply this colour not only to its underbelly, but to the back of its legs and anywhere else where we're seeing this same texture. Once you've made sure the first layer is entirely dry, you might want to come back in with the second layer and darken it down in places. Now, you want to do this in the shadowy areas, of course, thinking about where the skin might be a little bit thicker and looking for any areas where you think that it might just be a little bit darker, or there's just a slight variation in texture where the two textures meet. That's probably a good place to lay down a little bit extra colour, and it might look a little bit more natural. Once we're finished with that step, we're going to go onto the armoured panels. I'm going to use another contrast paint, in this case Skeleton Horde, but anything like this will do. You could use a very light ochre, something like that, and I'm going to again use that brush, make sure it's damp, and I'm just going to apply it over to all of the scaled elements on top. And you could do the horns and the bones as well. I am doing this, but I am going to come back in a little bit later on and start to darken those tips down. Again, that's an optional step. It's not something that you have to do, but the older the bone gets, the darker it tends to get. So making sure that those tips are a little bit darker is beneficial, especially if you're going for the more natural look. You could do this with multiple layers of this bone color, but I do like to come in with black later on and just pick out those tips. Now, the rest of the scales, I'm going to go fairly traditional. I'm going to use Plaguebearer Flesh, so we're going with a green. I'm not straying too far away from that lizardy look and feel, but you can use any color that you want, looking at your reference material or not. Now, I'm going to use the same technique of a very damp brush, and I'm going to start to apply this over the area between the bony armored protrusions and also the soft fleshy underbelly. And I'm not going to worry too much about where they intersect. If they mix together, the paint will still be a little bit wet because we thinned it down fairly considerably, and there is quite a high working time on contrast paints and speed paints. So you should get a fairly budget blending effect without putting too much effort in. If you're stuck for where to put this on the model, just look for where the textures differ, and that's where you want to have this color really appear predominant. Now, don't worry if you get anywhere on your armor, you can just wipe it off with your finger. Again, I'm not being too precious because we will be underlighting this later on. And once that's completely dry, we can start to think about adding a little bit more detail. Again, looking back to our reference image where the different elements of the different types of textures meet. What I'm going to use is a red and a purple shade. It doesn't matter about brand, again, I'm using Games Workshop, but any will do. And I'm going to start picking out other elements around the model. So things where it would be a little bit more fleshy, a little bit darker perhaps. So thinking around the mouth where the teeth are jutting out, where the legs meet the body, and that seam that's running down the entire length of the underside of the model, we're going to paint that as well. Now, looking at its neck as well, perhaps we want that to be a little bit of a different color. Red fading into a purple is going to look really great there. Now, we don't want to go too far because, again, bearing in mind we are going to have this underlit later on, so some of this will be lost. You might want to go with Rule of Cool and pick out a couple of key salient areas, anywhere that you want any particular detail to pop. Obviously, I'm going to pay particular attention to the face because that's going to be a focal point. So putting a little bit more time and effort in there is going to pay dividends later on for the finished model. And while that lot's drying, let's work on my armor plating. I'm going to grab a black paint and a dry brush, making sure it's nice and moist so that the paint flows off very easily. And I'm going to start attacking these scales from the top. Now I'm going to dry brush just over the tips of any of the bony protrusions. Like I say, I want to darken those down, and any of the top scales, really, this thicker armor plated scale dragon-like texture, I want to pick out a little bit more, paying particular emphasis, as I say, to the tips where it's a little bit darker. If you want to use your normal brush, come in and just give that tip a really small little dab of paint. You can always grab some water on your brush and blend it forward, remembering always that where you lift off with your brush is where the paint will be thickest. It will be more opaque there. So if you are going to do that, make sure you drag towards the tip, the sharpest point, and that will put you in good stead and give you a nice, easy, quick blend. Using a mixture of both that and dry brushing are going to give you a very quick, easy, and effective way to get the scales looking great in no time at all. We're getting pretty close to the end now, so I'm going to use a ochre mustardy colour, Dead Flesh in this case, from the Vallejo game colour range, and I'm going to selectively dry brush over areas of the Karkadrak that I want to pick out. Now, the teeth I'm going to come back later on, so I'm not being too precious about it, but as I said earlier, picking out some elements around the model that you want to draw emphasis to, or where you know that light is going to be catching and you want to get that OSL effect looking really nice and bright, it's probably worth putting a little bit more time and effort into just picking out those elements. Completely optional step, you don't have to do it. It's looking pretty good as it is. Now, again, be light, be gentle. You're almost applying no pressure other than the weight of the brush here. And it's going to pick out a couple of the scales, just the topmost ones if light's catching on there. And you are going to come back in and reinforce that area with any of the washes that you'd applied earlier if you want to make that effect a little bit more pronounced. This is where paying attention to detail and spending a little bit more time on characters really does start to pay dividends. This is starting to look really, really good. And we've almost put no effort into this model at all, have we really? Looking at it now, I'm not overly happy with the area around the mouth, so I'm going to come back in with a little bit more of that red shade we used earlier. I'm going to start to pick out a few more details around the mouth, reinforcing those details we picked out earlier. Nothing new, nothing special here. It's just been dulled down by that dry brushing that we did around the mouth to pick out some of the scales and the details. So we're going to reinforce what we did, just picking them out. Run your finger over it, get the colour on there, and let it stain. Don't be scared to use your hands. Sometimes mistakes aren't mistakes. Just because you see somebody wiping the finger across it doesn't mean that it is a mistake. I use it just to get almost a recess shade, but also just a tiny bit of colour applied to the topmost layer. I'm going to pick out around the eyes too. Looking at that reference photo again that we had earlier, shows us that there is a little bit more of pigmentation around there, a little bit more blood flow around the eyes where the skin would be a little bit thinner, and we want to show that on as model. And it again draws emphasis towards the pupil that we dotted. I'm not going to do anything particularly special with the eyes or anything like that. I'm not going to have any OSL coming from them. I want to keep this monster looking pretty much as natural as possible and still looking fairly mean, like it's going to really give you some damage if it gets older. Yeah? I mean, this guy is a gnarly looking beast, isn't it? And the final step, of course, is going to be the OSL. As always, the base for this is going to be white, and then we're going to flip-flop backwards and forwards with the airbrush, white and fluorescent pink backwards and forwards until we get to the level of saturation and glow we want, using a thin down white ink into all of the areas that I want to read as the glow, and that's going to be the hottest, brightest part. I'm not going to cover this in detail now. You've seen me do it a number of times by now. If you do want to see that in detail, go back to the earlier videos. The first basing video shows it in more detail, and then obviously the Chaos Knights. Do look at those. Do check it out. Let me know what you think. But for now, we're going to call these ones done, and let's have a look at the finished models. Okay, so there we have it. What do you think of the sculpt? I really am into this. I'll put the link in the description for where you can grab it. It came out really, really well on my 3D printer, and I don't particularly have a fantastic 3D printer, but it certainly does the job for what I want in my army. The Chaos Lord on Karkadrak, I really did like this. It turned into something I was particularly happy with. I thought I was just going to get through it and it's just going to be a unit that I have there occasionally use. Now it's ended up being a really nice centerpiece for this small force at the moment. It's growing. We're getting there with it. What have you done? How do you lead your armies? What do your Chaos Lords look like? Have you converted any up yourself? What do you think of that old Chaos Lord model? Let me know down in the comments. Let's have a chat. I'm going to leave it there for this video, but I'll catch you again in the next video. See you soon, guys.